Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. This is the new season of SCRIBO seminars, and we're so excited because we have an amazing lineup of speakers that are going to keep us busy until Christmas with a Christmas special surprise that I'm not going to be announcing this time round because I want you to follow us up to that end. But we have an array of speakers that are fantastic. It's incredible. We have speakers that are going to be talking about the Caroline Islands and the very weird script from the 20th century, China, an Armenian script of the first millennium BC, the mysterious disc, the first numbers ever notated, linear B, and today we are delving deep into the origins of graphic communication. And today it is my deep delight to welcome Genevieve from Petzinger. When we were building up this lineup of speakers for this autumn and winter, making up our SCRIBO seminar series, she was the first person that I thought of, and it was adamant that she had to be in the lineup because in 2016, I happened to read a fantastic book, which is entitled The First Signs Unlocking the Mysteries of the World's Oldest Symbols. And I happen to love my copy so much. I don't know if you can see, but it's very worn off and well loved and filled with sticks, post-its and question marks all over the margins. I have to say, Genevieve is quite a rock star, quite literally so, because she works on rock art and the oldest symbols from Paleolithic art. And she's also a star because, well, you know, she's a star if you've seen her wonderful TED Talk, which was viewed by more than 2 million people. And when I saw that talk and when I read her book, my interest, my curiosity were piqued so much that I thought I had to get in touch with her straight away. And it took me a while, and this seminar series was the best occasion and the best opportunity for doing so. Genevieve is a paleoanthropologist, and she is also a National Geographic explorer who's the recipient of a new grant that will enable her in 2021, I think, next year, to analyze and see a cave in Cantabria in Spain to study the signs and the symbols found on the rock therein, and to answer $1 million question. Did the Neanderthals from 40,000 years ago actually paint this cave and paint these symbols? And did the Neanderthals have the capacity, the ability to paint, to create artistic, symbolic, cognitive advanced art? So Genevieve is going to be talking possibly about the recent findings on some of the signs found on the rocks, possibly from Cantabria, but from all over Europe, Spain, Portugal, and France, because she's not afraid to wriggle and squeeze through caves in search of the most mysterious, incredible symbols ever found. And today she's going to honor us with a fantastic seminar, I'm sure, on animals, humans, and geometric signs, the origins of graphic communication. And of course, this ties in with the origins of writing, and that will be another $1 million question. What is the connection between this early graphic communication and the origins of written notation and written speech? Over to you, Genevieve. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. I was going to say that was very glow. I was going to say I was blushing. Thank you for the lovely introduction. There we go. Look at that. Well, thank you so much for having me. So, you know, this is one of my favorite subjects. So it's a pleasure to sort of talk about everything with all of you today. And I think what I thought I would do, because I was talking to Sylvia ahead of time, was I know that the institute there is more focused on like the origins of writing, which of course is later. And so I thought I would start even slightly back before the beginning and just sort of contextualize where are we at in the field right now with like the earliest graphic marks in the world. So I'm going to start there, and then we will wend our way up to Paleolithic Europe and my area of specialty. So we're going to start with, I was thinking it was so interesting as I was putting together these slides. So as of now, the story of modern humans is about 300,000 years old. So around 300,000 years ago, there's the convergence of genetics and like physical traits and everything that we would say Homo sapien has now come into existence. The funny thing is 2 years ago, that date would have been 200,000 years ago. And so, I mean, I think in a way that's one of the big themes I would say in paleoanthropology, and it's why it's so much fun to work in this field, is that, you know, things are constantly changing and we're learning new things all the time. And frankly, I mean, the amount of exciting discoveries is just endless. So take everything I'm saying today with a grain of salt is basically what I'm saying. Because next year we might discover some incredible new thing that, you know, then we have to rewrite the timeline. So as I always say, you have to be very flexible if you're a paleoanthropologist, because who knows what the next cool discovery could be. But yeah, so at the moment, our understanding is that around 300,000 years ago in Africa, Homo sapien arises. We used to think that that physically they were human, but that the mental, cognitive sort of development was later. It's seeming now, honestly, a lot more like they were probably fairly cognitively modern at the same time. And so what that does is it pushes back the dates of everything enormously. You know, even when I was an undergrad, they were still talking more about, you know, art started around 35,000 years ago. You know, it started more in Europe. So it was really like I was just starting to change in the early 2000s when I was an undergrad, that they started talking about, you know, hey, what about this stuff we're finding in Africa? And of course, now Africa is like the hotspot of incredible discoveries. So just really briefly, as of now, again, these are sort of the some of the cool, really interesting discoveries from there. So some of the oldest human graphic marks in the world are currently dated to around 100,000 years ago from South Africa. This is from the site of Blombos. And as you can see, I mean, these are fairly simple marks, but they're definitely purposeful engraved markings. And, you know, Chris Henselwood, Francesco D'Erico, and the teams that have studied it, you know, they're definitely purposeful. Like they were making those marks on purpose. And so, you know, this is really that, at the moment, sort of that first time that, you know, stone tool was put to stone plaque and that some visual markings were made. You'll notice that I said human graphic marks. There's just that recent announcement of some 125,000-year-old markings in on some, I think it was 2 bones in China. And so that might not actually even be human. So there's a whole other thing we can talk about in the discussion afterwards if people want to. But at the moment, humans seem to be in Africa, maybe up in the Levant. There is also a couple of what might be purposeful marks even slightly earlier in another site called Pinnacle Point, which is also in South Africa. So around this time, definitely our ancestors were starting to make these visual markings on different artifacts. And so that's kind of really, at this point in time, that somewhere around there seems to be where it started. We've got engravings. Then we have the oldest drawing in the world, which is fairly recent. This is 2018. So as you can see, everything's very new because we had engravings, but we had no paintings. And we were like, well, maybe, you know, were they painting? Were they not? We don't know. So as of a couple of years ago, they found this wonderful rock, which has it's sort of a crosshatch pattern, and it's made with an ochre crayon. So now we may potentially know what they were doing with the lower one. There's actually a piece of ochre in that picture. So, you know, what were they doing with this ochre, which, by the way, is iron oxide. So it's a mineral that comes out of the ground. And in later times, it's what's used to make paintings in Europe. Is the red paintings are generally iron oxide. So we've got paintings, we got drawings, we've got engravings. That one's about 73,000 years old. And then we've got these really interesting geometric representations, which currently, I think the ones on the right are actually ostrich eggshell. They're fragments of ostrich eggshell, and they have these patterns engraved on them. And they start around 80,000 years ago, maybe slightly older. And then the other ones are from the same site as those very early ones, but just slightly later, around 75 to 80. So we're starting to see crosshatches. We're starting to see sort of like filled in almost like ladder style signs. We're seeing rows of lines. What is so interesting about the ostrich eggshell, for example, that site of Deep Kloof is where those ones come from, is that they're found in multiple archaeological layers. And so, and what's fascinating is that there's only 5 main patterns that repeat across these layers across time, suggesting that, you know, this was something that was, it wasn't just somebody doodling, like it was very, like the design they were picking was something they were trying to replicate and then future generations were also trying to replicate, often with like some minor differences starting to sneak in, but there's these 5 main patterns. And so, you know, that really, of course, it seems like something that's a lot more purposeful. And also it suggests that it's not just an individual making the mark, there's also a group of people who can understand the mark. And that's really, in a way, at the base of all of this, really, right? Which is that, you know, what is graphic communication? It's the ability not just to make marks, but for other people to understand what you wrote. And so I think that that's where, again, when we're looking backwards, this is where I'm looking to sort of see where and how did symbolic behavior, which is what we would call this, like where did it start? What might have motivated it? You know, certainly with these ones, or with, here's another little pattern too from another rock shelter in South Africa, which is Clipster. With all these little patterns, you know, there's a few different theories as to what it could be. And certainly I think notation or some form of early tallying is one thing that's been suggested. And another one is that it could be some sort of identity mark. So whether that's just basically like, you know, this is Grog's ochre crayon, or whether this is like a family affiliation or some sort of tribal marking, but that idea that, which is very interesting because it actually, I mean, there's sort of that underlying sense of, you know, individuality and like self-identity and all of these other fascinating things, which again, you know, story of our lives when we're this far back. You know, if you're dealing with like Egypt or Rome or all these other places, you have writing, you have like big monumental architecture. We have little bits of like stone and eggshell that we have to build stories from. But it's amazing what I think you can do. And so this is where, when we look at those are the kinds of things we're thinking. Is that, yeah, identity marks, tallying, some sort of thing. The big thing that like Francesco Derrico and Chris Centralwood, who've done a lot of the work down here with the teams they work with and their colleagues, is the idea, and I think this is really almost in a way the most important thing to take away from this, is the idea of like an artificial memory system. And so what they mean when they say that, of course, is the idea that for the very first time, you can store information outside of your body in a more permanent, long-term fashion. And so it wasn't just a matter of communicating, being face-to-face, and they were sort of in the moment, but the idea being is that you could preserve that information. You can transmit the information, and not just to people who were there with you, but across time and space. And so this is a very, very powerful idea, and really foundational to so much of what we just take for granted today when it comes to graphic communication. So I often sort of see these guys as being like the sort of the original thinkers, and also artificial memory systems, of course. We take them for granted today. They're called computers. And so if you think about it, these are the very first potentially times that we see people trying to store and transmit information. So to me, that's what makes Africa so exciting. And frankly, I'm sure there will be many more discoveries to come in future decades. So I'm looking forward to it. Moving from there, and so we'll have to say goodbye to Africa and we'll start moving up. One of the things I find really quite fascinating is that based on all the current genetics, I mean, there's been multiple exits out of Africa of Homo sapien. I mean, we've started to realize that. They recently announced a skull in Greece that was, I think, about 200,000 years old almost, and that was a Homo sapien skull. So we know they were making it out. But thanks to, of course, the genetics, and this is where, you know, paleoanthropology is like this intersection of all these different fields. When we look at what are called the extant populations, so the populations that went on to populate the Old World and the New World, currently the genetics shows that it's this L3 haplogroup, which you can kind of see up there just off the coast of Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, all in that region right there. That is the group, or the groups, that actually over a fairly short time period left in these successive waves and are the ones who literally populated the entire Old World. And we find their genetic signature literally all the way from Australia to South America to, like, you know, Norway. It's everywhere. And so these are the underlying groups that moved out across the whole world. The thing is, it actually wasn't that many people who moved out. That's the other funny thing, is that, you know, it was like tens of thousands. It wasn't like, you know, millions of people. And they're from this one area of Africa. And so now, this is just my personal opinion. And so this is not like, at this point, it's theoretical. But I suspect that they already knew how to make art this is my thought. Like, I think they already were doing art, and I think it's one of the things they took with them when they left. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see, especially in the very early art, that there's a lot of similarity in different parts of the world, and then you see more change over time. So like I said, that's just my opinion. So, you know, I'm sure there's lots of people who disagree with me, but that's the fun of science, right? Come up with ideas and then go see what we can prove. But yeah, I'm curious, when I look at this, I see a lot of crossover in the early, especially in the science, which is what I study. So the abstract markings, and now in particular with the incredible new finds in Indonesia, and us now knowing that they were making art, you know, 45,000 years ago in Indonesia, basically. You know, and we see them doing things that are similar in some ways to what we see in Europe. I mean, I think, yeah, I'm curious to see what we'll find in the future, and how we'll be able to start filling in the gaps, because there's really a lot of gaps on that map still. So, you know, I'm sure it's out there just waiting to be found. But today we're going to follow the journey of the people who went up into the Ice Age Europe. So we're going to go to the Ice Age. We're going to go up to the Paleolithic. And like I was saying, when I was an undergrad, the Paleolithic was actually classified as being 10,000 to 35,000. So now we're up to 10,000 to 45,000 at least. And so, yeah, it's amazing how fast things are changing, and all the really cool new discoveries that are coming out. And frankly, there was a brand new discovery. Well, there's some new dates just announced out of Petzinger in Bulgaria that potentially push back the earliest sort of colonization by humans in that region, like 47,000. So again, may need to revise. But overall, it seems to be that these waves of people were moving out of Africa and across the old world somewhere around 60,000 years ago, basically, you know, plus or minus 5 to 10,000 years, which to us is nothing, right? Paleontologists. And so in that range, we've got people who moved up and then into Asia. We have people who kind of moved up into sort of the Near East and stayed there, or sort of into the Balkans. And so there was a lot of movement, but it seems like, interestingly, there wasn't a lot of movement west right off the bat, that it was more that they went up in more easterly, I think more like around sort of Black Sea, Caspian, kind of in that sort of range. And then they sort of pulled a left at some point and went into Western Europe. And so Western Europe is actually one of the later places to be settled by modern humans. When we think of them being there, of course, you know, the popular notions traditionally have sort of been of these, like, you know, sort of grubby cave people, wearing ugly fur outfits, and, you know, not being very smart and that kind of thing. Obviously that view's changing, and that's why I really wanted to show this this village scene, which is a recreation of what's thought to be one of the earliest village sites in the world. It's around 30,000 years old, and it's from the Czech Republic. And they were actually building, I think it's really cool, but again, I love this subject. But they were building their houses out of bone, because they're actually up in the tundra, like they're in the steppe, they're beyond the tree line here. But, you know, so it shows how adaptive our ancestors were. But what it was the ice sheets were not that much farther beyond that. So these incredible sort of walls of ice, but they melted and were a huge attractor to animals because of all the greenery that kind of grew along the base from all the water. And so it was actually a nice place to live, because your food basically walked by the door. But yes, so being these innovative people that they were, they used a lot of mammoth bone, and they actually built these sort of semi-subterranean dwellings that were much more permanent, as you can sort of see from this drawing. And that they were using bone, because there was no trees up there. There was no, you know, there wasn't other building materials in the same way. So these bone villages, I find them quite interesting. They're found literally all the way from the Czech Republic all the way across into like the eastern side of Russia. So like up in Siberia. So it's a fascinating era, frankly, in general. And just the idea that if you have these villages, incredible things start to happen. I don't know. I feel like our ancestors, when you get them together and you give them a bit of spare time, because again, some people actually seem to have been living here year round. So again, we're not talking about hunter-gatherers, you know, sort of with a hard life, you know, desperately scrabbling across the landscape. We're talking about people who are quite settled and who started inventing things like pottery kilns, and they were firing pottery almost 30,000 years ago. And they were making flutes. They were doing all sorts of cool things there. So I think in that sense that, you know, we have to really think of them as being very much modern and very much like us. And that, so it's not surprising to see that they're doing these sophisticated symbolic activities. How's that? I guess that's what my big setup is. My pitch for our ancestors, being like that. So, you know, with modern humans, we're going to see modern behavior. And now, that village is actually a bit later, but, you know, by 40 to 45,000, we have them settling in several big pockets kind of in Europe. So we've got a settlement in Germany. We've got what looks like something around Bulgaria. There's a few other sites that are sort of plus 40,000. We've got them making jewelry. We've got, I think there's over 40 flutes now that have been found at different sites in France and Germany, and one in the Czech Republic as well. So, you know, we've got musical instruments. They're doing a lot of very complex activities. They're absolutely what I would call, they're non-utilitarian. They're not necessary for survival, and yet they're spending the time and energy to do them. And so I think that tells us a lot about the way their minds were working, the way they were sort of being influenced by the world around them, how they were influencing their world. So this is my big setup as to what people were like back then. And one of the earliest things that we see is, of course, figurines are quite early on. And the one on the left, the Lowenmensch, is the Lion Man from one of the German sites. And what's so fascinating here, of course, is that not only are we talking about quite a large figurine too, carved out of mammoth ivory, but the fact it's half human, half animal tells you as well that we're looking at imagination here, because nothing like that exists in the world, right? So either it could be some sort of a couple of people in my field have been doing some interesting work, kind of looking at the origins of storytelling, and you know, it's possible that this could represent a deity or some sort of origin story. Much more practically, it could also be somebody wearing a headdress. So there's lots of different things it could be, but it's definitely not something that occurs in nature. So we're seeing a lot of creativity as well. And then because I study those little geometric signs, I'm also quite fascinated by the row of lines down its shoulder, which again, people have wondered what that could have been. Is it supposed to be paint? Does it maybe represent tattoos? You know, is it some other marking on it? So yeah, it's interesting to see, because quite a few of the ivory figurines out of Germany, because Germany produced a lot of ivory figurines from around that 40,000 year mark. And a lot of them do have geometric symbols on them as well. So that's kind of just an interesting aside. And then I just had to include the other figurine there that's on the right, which is from Siberia. And just because when we think about figurines, so often we think of like those sort of like the va-va-voom, like the sort of Venus figurines. But frankly, a lot more of them look like this than have that sort of Venus shape to them. And I find it quite fascinating, the detail on this one, where it looks like, you know, they're wearing potentially some sort of hood, maybe a jacket, so that we're seeing actually quite impressive representations in how they're representing humans, how they're representing figurines. So again, a lot of sophistication in the art. And certainly, from my point of view, not only with that art, but then also with the rock art, which we're about to talk about, is that, you know, I think, to me, when I'm looking at the way they're behaving, the type of artifacts that we're finding even at these early sites, it doesn't seem like it's the beginning of something. It feels more like it's the continuation. Like they already seem to be quite good at what they're doing. And we're not finding the sites in Europe, which are like the practice sites, or like, you know, the first time somebody attempted to make a figurine. It seems like these are already things they're quite skilled at doing. And so to me, that's also where I'm like, you know, I start to wonder, well, where did it come from? And so that's certainly something I'm intrigued about looking at in the future, is trying to understand, where did it come from? And, you know, obviously, some of it's certainly going to be locally, culturally produced as well, because, you know, again, over time, culture is going to start impacting what we're seeing. And we certainly see that with the art, we see it with the artifacts, that that's normal. And we would see that anywhere in the world. But it's interesting to kind of wonder, you know, where did it come from? What did they bring with them? What's local? What's a new innovation? All that kind of stuff. So things I hope to study more in the future. So turning to my absolute favorite topic, which is the actual cave art itself. Here's the state of the field now, which again could change. So we're looking at nowadays there's just over about 400 sites. I think I have 408 sites in my database right now. And so, because that's actually how I kind of keep track of the sites in the science I study. But there's definitely at least 400 sites, and they're in Europe. traditionally, the big regions have been France and Spain, Portugal, of course, with the Coa Valley, the whole series of them as well. We're starting to branch out now, which is exciting, and find them in other countries. Italy, of course, has a good number too. But I think that's what's exciting, and it's been, in a way, I think it's what needs to really happen, because it's those blank spots on the map again. And so a colleague of mine, Aitor Ruiz Redondo, has been doing some really fascinating work where he's been moving into new areas like in the Balkans, and he's been finding art. And so I think as well, we've got 400 sites, but I have a feeling that it's probably like a fraction of what used to exist. Not only just that we haven't found a whole lot of them, and I'm sure a lot of them got destroyed. And then also, what was a really interesting insight for me as well was when I was in Portugal at the Coa Valley, the art there's actually out in the open. And a lot of it is right in the vicinity of where they live. So that literally they lived here, you could look up the hillside and there would have been like these beautifully engraved animals for you to admire. And so I think the environment there is unusual in the sense it's allowed it to preserve in a way where it really hasn't lasted much of Europe. But I suspect that Europe itself was probably a very decorated landscape during the Ice Age. And so that there probably was a lot of, like, the amount of art we've lost is hard to even fathom. So in that sense, we always have to keep in mind that caves are like they're a good microclimate to protect things, right? Because they're enclosed. And so, but it really, that it's probably only a piece of what is out there, or what was out there. And so that, you know, again, when we look at caves and sort of see them with our modern gaze of, you know, we don't spend a lot of time hanging around caves. Well, most of us don't. I do sometimes, but most of us don't. So, you know, for us, caves have a very different vibe than they might if you lived in the entrance to a cave and going deeper was your backyard. And so I think in that sense that we need to keep that in mind as well, that we don't necessarily understand the context of what the art would have been for them. And then again, it probably, in my opinion, it's probably a lot of things. I'm guessing there's probably not one explanation for everything. There's probably a whole range of reasons why they were making art. But also we find like children's footprints in the caves. And so I think they were well traveled in a way that we don't always think about when we kind of sort of see them as these dark, mysterious places, which they may have been at times as well. So how's that? There's my broad sense of, you know, what were the caves for, which is probably everything. So we've got the caves, we've got rock shelters, especially in France. There's a good section of rock shelters. So that's just where there's kind of a covering, and some of the art survived under that sort of protective covering. And then we have open air sites like I was just mentioning in Portugal. And again, probably way more open air sites that are no longer around at this point in time. When we talk about making the art, it's fairly evenly divided between engravings and paintings. And so the engravings were made either using a tool of some kind and like spray paint on the wall, or they were made sometimes using actually fingers, because of course cave walls can be fairly soft at times. And so some of them, I mean, I've seen some incredibly sophisticated drawings actually done with by finger. So, you know, again, that's sort of the engraved / finger painting. And then we also have the paintings, which is mostly red and black. Those are generally, the majority of the art is made out of those two colors. And then there is also examples of purple, even sort of pink, which is sort of a variant on the red. We've got yellow, we've got brown, and then very rarely you do see white, and that's made of kaolin clay. And the red, of course, is iron oxide, so what we call ochre, and so it's a red mineral. But again, it can sometimes come in yellow variants and purple variants. And so certainly in northern Spain, there's a cool chunk of caves where there's a lot of purple in them. So lots of different options. And I just included the top picture there on the right. I just love that. We were in La Pasiaga in Spain. So this is a cave in Spain that was visited many times over many different time periods. And but that's an original mixing block. So they actually would have ground up the ochre on that block and mixed it up and then used that to paint the walls. And so I got really excited when I saw it, because, you know, again, it's like you don't often sort of see the preparation of it. So my husband and I work together, so I was like, you have to take a picture of that so I can show people what it looks like. So yeah, so that's from I think they were saying that one probably is somewhere around like 20,000 or so probably. So interesting to sort of imagine an artist working there 20,000 years ago and creating their paint. And then the bottom ones, just to sort of, again, reiterate what I've been saying about sort of the sophistication of our Paleolithic ancestors, which was that while they certainly used torches in some caves, they also came up with these fantastic stone lamps, which burned animal fat and often used like moss and things like that as a wick, which would of course allow them to stay in the caves for much longer and created much nicer conditions, because torches are pretty smoky and a lot of those caves are fairly enclosed. So to see them not just making the art, but also the prep in a way, and the forethought and the planning that had to go into some of the art, really suggests this is something that was very important to them, very integral to their cultures and their societies. And again, I think in Lascaux in particular, there's some evidence potentially there of even them having scaffolded, like used to scaffolding to be able to get up higher. So a lot of thought is going into at least some of the art. In other cases, I think it probably maybe could have been a doodle on a rainy day. They were bored and they're like, oh, what the heck, we'll just draw a couple things. Because of course, and I should have included some, but because it never makes the books, but there is also bad art. It does exist. I've seen some pretty bad stuff, so, which would be about what I would create if I was in charge, because I'm not a very good artist. So, but yeah, mostly it's pretty impressive, frankly, how good the art actually is, considering there wasn't a lot of room for error or for them to fix what they've done if they made a mistake on the walls. So it's pretty impressive to see, that's for sure. So let's talk about the actual art themes. And again, this is, keep in mind that these are the categories that were created by researchers, right? Like modern researchers who wanted to study the art. So, if you were able to ask a Paleolithic person how they categorize their art, it would probably be completely different. But the way it's been done for the last 100+ years around here is that we have divided it by themes. So we see figurative art. So figurative art's art that looks like something recognizable from the real world. And then we have non-figurative art, which is those sort of abstract geometric signs. So for the figurative art, the majority of it is animals, and particularly game animals. And so things like, we've got the deer, we've got horses, bison. Bison and horses in particular account for, I believe, around 60% of all the animal imagery. So very, very common, very popular. Now, stylistically, it did change over time, and there's been some really detailed studies, looking at the change in the way the hoops are portrayed, the way the muzzle is. There's lots of change over time stylistically, which again kind of tells us that it's reflecting cultural change, it's reflecting potentially new people moving into areas, since again people did move around the landscape, as well as also trading and sharing sort of new ways of doing things. But overall, across time and space, animals account for the vast majority of figurative art, and traditionally they've probably been the most heavily studied category as well, just because, again, I mean, they're impressive. And it's not surprising that the early researchers in the early 1900s there, I think they were already trying to wrap their heads around the idea that people from so long ago, who they were envisioning as being much more primitive and very much more sort of the knuckle draggers, how were they able to do art that was so good? I think it was definitely something they were trying to understand. And also, so again, and animals are more approachable, because at least, even if you don't know what it means, because again, culturally, the last person who could have told us anything died 10,000 years ago. So, in that sense, we don't have any cultural informants. We don't have people who can fill in those blanks for us. But at least if you're starting with an animal image, you can say it's a bison. Now, is it a real bison? Is it a spirit bison? Is it like a clan, some sort of totem? Who knows what it is, but at least you have a start point. And so I think traditionally that's where, with the non-figurative art, has been seen to be more complicated to deal with, precisely because, they're like, we don't know what it is, right? It's a scribble line. So what do you say about a scribble? And so I think that's another reason why the animals have been this sort of popular theme to study. More rarely, but still also there, are the the humans. And so we do find some humans as well, not nearly as many, but there's more than often sort of people realize they are there. This is a very late site from Grotta della Dora in Sicily, where I work. And I just like this because it's an actual scene, which is not something we commonly associate with cave art in Europe. Cave art in Europe is generally more like, when you look at, they're just sort of like animals. and it's like the wall, and there's an animal, and it's just kind of floating there, and there's not a lot of context. It doesn't seem to be kind of like woven into sort of daily life or anything like that. Whereas with other rock art traditions, you find like village scenes, or you find hunting like scenes. There's a lot more that has been identified as these sort of like more unified panels, whereas a lot of the art is more just sort of standalone. But this one's about 11,000 years old, I believe. And this one actually has a series of humans dancing around what appear to be two hog-tied humans in the middle. So, you know, if they're lucky, maybe it's some sort of rite of passage. If they're unlucky, maybe it's some sort of sacrificial scene. But there actually appears to be something going on. And some of the figures around the outside have what almost look like bird heads. So whether that's, again, a mask, whether it's an early story, or, you know, again, we don't know what precisely represents, but it is an interesting one. Of course, I live on the west coast of Canada, I should point out. So we're in the middle of being covered in smoke from all the American fires. We're about 100 kilometers from the American border here. So you'll have to excuse me if I suddenly get coughing a little bit, but it's pretty, I can actually see the smoke outside. We can't see the sun today. So, yeah, it's like apocalyptic out there. Okay, so we've got our animals, we've got our humans. So let's get to the good stuff, which, well, my opinion anyways, I'm sure other colleagues would disagree who like to study the animals. The geometric signs. So like I was saying, the geometric signs, first off, they're defined as basically being abstract objects that are not recognizable sort of as real world objects. For the last 100+ years, anything that pretty much wasn't an animal or a human has been stuffed into this category. And I say stuffed because there's a lot of things in there. And, you know, I think in that sense, you know, it's everything from triangles to dots to more complex shapes. So there's quite a bit of, there's a lot going on in there. And certainly from my work and from my perspective on it, I've often wondered, you know, so here, let me show you some examples. There we go. So yeah, so we've got really simple things like dots, little cruciforms, so 3 cruciforms. Then we have much more sophisticated shapes, like the lower left one there, which is from El Castillo, which, you know, could be some sort of clan sign. Other people say maybe it's a boat. So yeah, one of the funnest things with cave art is that honestly we don't really know, so we have a lot of fun trying to figure out what stuff is. But you know, again, you have to take it all with a grain of salt because we don't really know. Though I might have some ideas that I will share with you later. And then up top there we have again kind of a mixed panel. So there's a wide variety of signs, and these are all currently classified in this one category. But you know, I wonder. Yeah, and here's a big list for you. That's kind of what I see. And so these are the ones that tend to repeat at caves. There are outliers, like sort of ones that appear once and not really again anywhere, and those aren't included. But these are the ones that tend to repeat across time and space throughout the European Paleolithic. And what's so interesting though is, yeah, I mean, we've decided they're a category, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who lived back then would have thought that an asterisk went with like a W sign. Like they would not necessarily have seen any relationship there. And again, if we're looking at themes like we are with the animals and humans, where we're like, we have this category of thing, which is an animal, or we have a category of thing, which is people. Or in other rock art traditions where we have categories of, you know, village, like daily life stuff, or like weaponry, or, you know, all these other categories, which is often subdivided. In this case, we don't have that. And so what we end up with is kind of this hodgepodge of signs. And so that's really where I built this, mostly because I was trying to understand, you know, how often they do repeat at different sites. And, you know, is it across space, is it across time? Are there patterns to it? And there most certainly are. Like every single one of these signs has its own pattern of use, which is what's so interesting. And some of them are there right from the beginning. Others are later inventions. Some of them are very much like regionally located, like only one region has the sign and none of it. In other cases, they're very widespread and we find them everywhere. And there's a lot of them, especially some of the simpler ones, like the dots or the lines, that probably have like multiple meanings based on, you know, time, space, context, right? So that, you know, in some cases, maybe lines represent a tallying, right? Like they're counting something. In other cases, you know, maybe they could represent something completely different. Same with the dots. Dots are another one where I've seen all sorts of interesting interpretations, and you know, they're all quite reasonable based on when they are. So even things like dots and lines quite commonly appear at like in caves, almost in like sort of path marker type locations. And so, which again would be very logical. If you're hanging around in caves, it's good to be able to know your path, right? And so there's been there was a good study out of the Basque country. I think it was with Diego Garate was on that study, and they were looking at the in one of the caves there, I think the Moving Couple, where again it seems like a lot of these dots and lines were appearing at these points where there were splits and passageways and things like that. So yeah, I see that there's a lot of potential for a lot of different things, and so I've got this geometric sign category, but I sort of see it as being very artificial. How's that? And so really, what I've been doing, so now we're getting to the writing stuff here. So of course for the institute, is I think we've got this category, but I mean again, you can't analyze stuff if you don't know what's there. And so really, the work I've been doing up to this point is just trying to inventory, and trying to create so that I have fairly accurate inventories for all 400 caves, and so that I know, how many dots are there, and where are they located, what time period are they assigned to, and same with all of the other ones as well. And so with that in place, though, I believe that the geometric sign category is something that probably in the future will cease to exist or may get a lot smaller, because I believe there are things that are currently housed there that really probably should be their own category. And so I'm hopeful going forward that that might be something that I can help start that process off. How's that? So again, of course, when we see things, especially like for instance this row of signs in the site of La Pasiaga, early researchers actually called it the inscription, because it has that look about it, right? Especially with kind of the line underneath, it almost looks like some sort of writing system. But again, we're not talking about writing yet. Writing is, it's an actual, writing is a system, right? I mean, well, I'm speaking to people who know much better than me, but the idea that writing system, anything you can think, you can write, and we're talking about a very small number of signs here. We're not talking about something that would actually cover that full sort of range of spoken word. There's not structure in the same way. We're not seeing structure. We're not seeing the kinds of things that you would normally have. Plus, frankly, hunter-gatherers really don't have much need necessarily for a full writing system. It's actually kind of a hassle to maintain. You need like specialists who basically that's their job. And so if you've got a group of 20 to 30 people, you might have somebody who kind of does the art and things like that, but they're not, you're not going to have these like sort of specialists who are then teaching other people in these very formal settings like we see in later actual proper writing systems, like with cuneiform or hieroglyphics or things like that. So I think what we might be seeing though are the very first glimmers of that behavior. And I think that, not just in Europe, but elsewhere around the old world, that, this is the time and the place where people were starting to experiment with these artificial memory systems, with the ability to leave these visual marks that other people could then come along and read. And so when I look at it, that's why I tend to look at it sort of in that broader idea of graphic communication, because is it writing? No. Is it graphic communication? Absolutely. And what I mean by that is that the person who made it made very deliberate decisions as to what to put on that wall. And other people who are within that context, so within that culture, within that time period, within that world, would have been able to come along and understand it. And so in that sense, it very much is, it is communication and it is graphic. It's just that at this point, if I had to hazard a guess, I would guess that it's probably, just a few of kind of the important concepts or important words or important, those kind of the first things you tend to see. But, to understand this a lot better, because of course, it's a little, it's not radical, but I'm trying to make that, I am interested in that connection. I'm interested in the idea of how did we get from there to here. And so I've had the opportunity during my doctoral research to actually spend quite a bit of time looking at photo writing and trying to look for, are there certain repeating themes with it? Is there certain things maybe we can draw from that and then use that perspective to look backward. And so I think to me, when I'm looking at the sign, probably the most helpful insights that I got out of a lot of these sort of, so, you know, things like cuneiform, before it looked like that funny little stick writing, actually in its proto form were also iconic. So again, we're looking at things that could be understood. Like you could look at an ox and it did look a bit like an ox, right? So, or you looked at a star, it looked a bit like a star. So all of the original proto writing systems seem to have two main elements to them, which is to have some sort of tallying marks, and then they seem to have sort of a smaller set of important sort of iconic characters that are not a full writing system at all, but just a few important things. And in some cases, they're very thematically narrow. And so, for instance, with cuneiform, Denise Schmatt-Besserat has done some fascinating work. And it's almost depressing to think that the earliest stuff potentially with cuneiform is all like related to business and economics. But, you know, there we have it, deep in our history. But, you know, that the oldest stuff all seems to relate to economic transactions. And so the icons are related to things that you can trade or buy, right? So animals and like grains and things like that. And then there's also the tallying marks in order to keep track. So we see it there, you know, even in the earliest sort of Chinese writing as well, you know, there it's more that they're doing oracles with it. But again, it's this narrow area where they've created these symbols that allow them to communicate within this particular realm. It's just not a full language yet. And same with, you know, the Egyptian hieroglyphs. All of them have that same kind of theme of smaller group of things, and the character has much more of a one-to-one meaning with what it represents. And so at that point, it's still a bit more recognizable. And then it's only over time that they become more stylized. And then, you know, eventually as things like an extension happens. So like, for instance, you know, you just originally have an asterisk that represents like a star or something, but then it also starts to represent other related words like the sky or a god who lives in the sky. And so you start seeing this whole other layer of complexity that starts to form, but that comes later. And so what I was interested in is kind of the earliest stuff, and then seeing, you know, well, would that make sense? And so I think this is where, with that set of eyeglasses on, how's that? Like that sort of semiotic, linguistic kind of eyeglasses, I've gone back and I'm looking at the science again in a way, and sort of saying, well, let's actually talk about it. Is it, you know, certainly when I look at it, I would say I'm betting some of these are related to tallying and notation. I think Alexander Marshak is a figure in our field who, you know, talked a lot about that. I don't agree with all of his interpretations necessarily, but at the same time, I think he was absolutely right that, you know, they were keeping track of things, which would make really good sense. It would make sense for them to keep track of seasons. It would make sense for them to keep track of lunar cycles. Like there's so many things that would be useful for them to track. And so I'm sure some of these marks in here probably do represent that, at least again in certain contexts. And I think the big thing with the art is the idea that it's not going to be like a one size fits all, that certain things probably have a very specific meaning in a certain spot, but they could mean something different if they're elsewhere. And that's really where it sort of comes down to trying to sort of sort through that in a way and kind of figure it out. But there's other signs in here which do look a little bit like real world objects, frankly. And I mean, on the one hand, I think we have to be really careful about interpretation, but you know, and certainly again, keeping in mind that we can't know what things mean, because, you know, how do you prove it, right? And so I think you have to be cautious in that sense. But at the same time, I wonder if maybe we've been a little too careful about not wanting to, you know, being like, oh, I don't want to interpret anything, so we're just gonna stick them in this category and talk about them in an abstract way. But I don't know. I wonder. I think there might be some other stuff going on there. How's that? So I thought I would kind of finish up by talking about a few of those things, because this is directly what I've been working on for my doctoral research. And very specifically, actually, is the question of hunting. Because again, these are hunter-gatherers, right? Like hunting is very central to their existence. And you know, there are sites like this is from Neo in France, for instance, where they've got this classified as a wounded bison, and as you can see, there's two things sticking out of the side of it, which are often sort of referred to as a penniform or ramiform. Like they've got these kind of Latin names for them, and they're being a little bit more neutral. But I mean, if you look at it, it really does look like it's a spear or something sticking out of the side of a bison. And certainly people in the past have questioned that. They've studied it. There's been a few studies. So the Deluxe have studied it, looking at sort of, you know, blood and death and like all that kind of thing, and looking for sort of examples of like bleeding wounds and things like that. We also have G and Olet who've done stuff, and Dominique Baffier. So there's definitely some studies have been done. People have noticed it and sort of said, you know, hey, is this a thing? What's interesting though is that it's only 2 to 3% of animals have some sort of thing sticking out of them or on the side of them, right? And so in that sense, when they've looked at it, it's, you know, it's a thing, but it's not like a major theme in that sense. How's that? So I think that's kind of where it was sitting at when I decided to flip the question around, because of course, what I've been doing for my research is compiling this database, which is geometric sign focused. And so what I did instead was I asked the question in reverse, which was, at sites where we have penniforms, how often do they appear on the sides of animals or humans or in like close association with them? And so here's the fun part. So this is like the first time I've ever really talked about this. I'm going to be defending it later this term, but so here you go. This is like the world premiere. So back to the question. So how often do penniforms appear on the sides of animals or humans at caves where they're present? And the answer is it's 90% of the time. Yes, I know, it's so statistically significant. So, you know, for all the academics, it's like, yeah, no, the numbers are amazing. It was so exciting to run those numbers and get such positive results. So, you know, that's the thing, is that basically if penniforms are in caves, they're almost always on the side of animals. And on the very rare occasions when they're not, you know, again, maybe that can help us understand better what those might be when they're not in the context, right? And so what's so fun though is not only just the statistical analysis of looking at it that way, but then also going to the archaeology and realizing that, so penniforms are a sign that's actually invented later. They don't exist at the time that humans come into Europe. We don't see them in the early art. The oldest example I was able to find was sort of more in like what's called the Gravettian period, so 28,000 kind of thing. What's fascinating is around then, they invented a new type of harpoon weapon, which actually looks like that in the real world. And even the section of France where we first start finding them is the same area where they start making this new innovative tool. And so, you know, so you can imagine I got really excited to sort of see that. And so I think there's some really interesting support in this particular case. I think you could make the argument that penniforms probably represent weaponry. Yeah, there's more to it than that, but that's the argument in a nutshell. And so what I then did was I looked at other signs where, again, they also appear sometimes on the sides of animals, because it's not just the penniforms. You also get dots appearing on the side of animals, lines. You get sort of these open angles. And when I ran the stats for them as well, it was also very interesting to see that there was these patterns of use where they do tend to show up on animals, but it's different because, again, they also do appear in other contexts separately. But there definitely seemed to be a baseline with all of those where they are regularly appearing on the side of animals throughout. And again, in certain eras, it's more popular, so you can actually watch like sort of change over time. But sort of based on that research, I mean, I would make the argument that I think there are signs that really, that, you know, maybe we do need to talk about having like a category for weapons or for hunting related sort of imagery. You know, and so I think that's one set that knowing that, you know, all the earliest systems in the world don't have really sophisticated symbols off the bat. They more tend to be these iconic shapes that are kind of reflective of real world things. Here we have, especially like with this picture from Neo, a very realistic looking bison. Why would there not be a realistic weapon hanging out of its side, right? And so I think in that sense, that might help provide us with some clues that, you know, maybe some of the geometric signs are real world objects. And we've just been a little too cautious. And again, cautious is good because we can't know for sure. But, you know, if we're able to do some statistical analysis, if we're able to bring in the archaeology, you know, I think there are cases to be made for at least with some of the signs that, you know, they are real world objects. And I mean, I'm not the only person saying that either. There's been some really interesting cases recently with, you know, the idea that maybe there could be some mapping out there going on. And so that, again, maybe some of the things that, like the open angle sign, could represent mountains, or that there's certain kind of sort of these sort of meandering shapes that could represent rivers. And so, again, contextually, it'll depend on where it is and, you know, what else is around it. But, you know, I think there's arguments could be made, because it's always been one of the things that's really strange about cave art, in my opinion. And here I'll show you another one, which is, you know, we've got hunter-gatherers. So, you know, where's the gathering stuff? I know it's not as exciting and flashy as, you know, big angry bison or mammoth or whatever, but, you know, again, they were also, you know, very dependent on plants and on different types of food as well. And so, you know, maybe there are some portrayals of plants or trees or things like that, you know, that we just, again, we haven't recognized formally. And again, it's something that, you know, often sort of rock art researchers will say, you know, hey, it looks a bit like that or a bit like this. But, you know, it's not something that's sort of formally being recognized, or, you know, like talking about, like, should we be recategorizing things? So I think, you know, again, plants is another one, but just overall, it seems odd that, so when you look at other rock art traditions around the world, they so often reflect the world around them. And yet in Europe, it's more that, like, we have all these things missing. Like, I mean, I'm always like, you know, did nobody look up? Like, what was happening? You know, there's this incredible moon, there's these stars in the sky, like, all of these things would have been very important. There's all these landscape features around them. And so that's where, you know, oh yeah, and insects, of course, too. I had somebody who's an entomologist actually suggest to me about this image, you know, well, hey, this could be, there's a certain type of butterfly, I guess, that, you know, maybe has this sort of look about them. So again, you know, we call them reniforms, which means kidney shaped, but, you know, it could be a real world object as well. And so, you know, again, would they represent insects? You know, they're not as, again, they're not big and sexy like mammoth or bison, but it doesn't mean, you know, they wouldn't represent them sometimes in the art. And then, of course, like I said, looking up in the sky. So, you know, in the site of Lascaux, there was a study a while ago where they were making the argument that potentially, you know, some of the groups of dots that are in there, you can sort of see around the head of the bull there, could either be the Pleiades, and then the lower one could be Orion's belt. And so, you know, again, we have to figure out, you know, as with all these things, it's almost like you come up with these questions and you have to try and figure out, you know, is there a way that we can indirectly get at it since we don't have anybody to ask? You know, and I think the big thing now is that with the capacity of databases, with AI, with the ability to build like really sophisticated algorithms, I actually think there is the possibility of exploring some of these questions further. So it's certainly something I hope to be doing in the future. And then same with the lower one, which are, so these are two tectiforms from Pont de Gaume in France. But if you look at them, they look awfully suspiciously like dwellings. So, you know, again, maybe they were representing houses or camps sometimes. And I know that there was actually just recently a plaque was found near an open air site in Spain where they made that exact argument, because frankly, the shapes on the plaque looked a lot like what open air tents probably look like. And so I feel like we're entering an era where we're more willing to talk about it again. I think the problem was, like, in the early 1900s, people went really crazy with, like, oh, this is this and that means this, and this is like this full secret language, you know, and I think they went so overboard that it was like the researchers who came after were like, well, we need to rein this in and, like, you know, be careful about what we're saying because, you know, we can't know for sure. And so, but I feel like maybe there's a group of us that are all kind of like, hey, you know, if we're cautious, if we use all these scientific methods to approach it, maybe it is possible to have some of these conversations and to start trying to better understand, you know, what would they have been representing, what might have been important to them, what makes sense, and then, you know, is there a way that we can prove it, especially with all the technology at our disposal now. I'll get there in a second. So yeah, so that's where I'm at. That's basically what I'm studying in the new projects going forward. Definitely are things where I'm plotting and planning ideas about how could we try some of this. But from the point of view, since of course all of you at the Institute are interested in the origins of writing, I suspect that at least some of the geometric signs probably really are early versions of like iconic imagery. And that's really what we're seeing, is that it's that first stage towards stylization, which is also what's making us a little cautious about saying, hey, could it be this? Because it kind of looks like the real world object, but not necessarily completely. And so to me, I would say then that those the proto-writing roots may reach very deep. How's that? And that, you know, I don't know, maybe we need a proto category, like that sort of first stage. But I feel like that's, you know, and again, it's becoming more sophisticated over time. Like we don't see them lining up the signs in the same way in the ordination at the beginning as we do the way they're starting to use the signs towards the end. There is a definite evolution and development as to how they're using them. And by the end, we are starting to see them, you know, they're lined up more often. They're just being used differently, and they appear in groupings a little more often. So I think we are definitely seeing that, you know, this was advantageous for them to have this method of communicating, and that of course they would have been refining it and improving it and figuring out what worked for them as they went along. And that, you know, as the Ice Age ended around 10,000 years ago, they stopped. It's really interesting because they just sort of stopped making art in caves almost entirely. I mean, there's still in Spain, there's Levant, like there are Levantine, but you know, overall they're not painting caves the way they used to be. And frankly, it actually stops even a little sooner, probably by about 13,000. They're not doing much. But what we do see is a huge surge of portable pieces with again more complex markings on them. So like different series of dots, different series of lines. So we're starting to see more series of things, which to me might be that sort of part of that whole process of, you know, the very first layer of laying down sort of a proto-writing system, which again, if you're a group of hunter-gatherers, you don't need some really big, complicated system. You're not trying to manage like, you know, a multi, you know, sort of stratified society, which needs a bunch of regulations that everybody, you know, is able to follow the same thing. You don't need, you know, this whole class of people to kind of maintain your system for you. All you need is a practical system that lets you, you know, keep track of the days in the moon cycle, right? Or that, you know, allows you to identify, you know, who's your clan and who's not, right? So, you know, I think there's just very different goals. And I think that that's also where we have to understand that writing doesn't necessarily, is not an automatic outcome necessarily. I think there's certain times and places where it makes really good sense, and I think there's other times where it's just probably not needed. And I think that's probably the reality of what we've seen around the world, is that where it's really pushed into development is usually where you have these societies where it's actually helpful to have. But I think if you track it back, I believe that the first glimmers are hiding there during the Paleolithic. And so I think it's a matter of, you know, with time, it might even be possible to make some more connections between the two if we're looking at the very end of the Paleolithic and the very beginning of the Neolithic. I think there might be a couple pathways I can see where we might start to be able to make more connections in the future. So there's my geometric science with that. And I just wanted to finish by talking about Neanderthals in art. Since of course this, you know, it's like the hot topic, right? It's kind of the big question in the field. And since it sort of covers what I'm looking at, hopefully what we're going to go do next summer. So in a nutshell, just over the last, I mean, you know, there's the debates going back and forth so many times about, you know, do Neanderthals make art? Do they not? There's definitely groups in both camps in my field. And again, I mean, that's what science is about, right? People have ideas, they like to question each other, you know, that's how it should be. But, you know, and again, in more recent years, there's been a few cases where it's been harder to refute. How's that? And certainly one of them is Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, where there's the infamous hashtag was found engraved on a wall where only Neanderthals had ever lived there. And so again, it makes it a hard argument that, you know, the humans like snuck in and did it when the Neanderthals weren't looking or something, right? And so, you know, I think in that sense, you know, but also like we do have portable pieces that Neanderthals have also engraved. And Francesco D'Erico, Sarah Evans, there's some people who are doing some really cool research with that and looking at these sort of portable pieces. So I think, in my mind, I think it might have been there a little more than we cared to admit in the past, but I think it's actually, I think the signs have been there for a while that Neanderthals were probably making marks as well. It's just, and part of it also could even just be sort of a bit of a lingering prejudice towards the idea that this other species could be as cool as we are. But I think, you know, we're running out of things they didn't do, right? And so art's kind of been that last bastion in a way. But we've got Gibraltar has hashtag there. And then of course we've got these discs which are from El Castillo. So this is a close-up of where they took some sampling from the calcite there. And so what they were doing is they were doing what's called uranium series dating. And so what that is it's an indirect dating method that they're basically, you know, that pretty translucent stuff that kind of drips down and makes like beautiful sort of layers on the walls in caves. Well, there's naturally occurring uranium in it, just at really low levels. But over time, because it's radioactive, it breaks down into some of its components. And what you can measure is how much of it has broken down, and it can give you a sense of time. And the beautiful dating is that it's not limited the way carbon dating is. Carbon dating above 40 to 50,000 starts getting pretty sketchy. So this has the potential to give you a lot more. Now, again, there is also some argument and controversy about how accurate uranium series dating is. So I won't even get into that, but I will just say that, yeah, there's definitely people questioned it, but you know, with any dating method, right? But in this case, you can see the little scrape marks. And so what they did was they're not actually measuring the date at which the art is made, they're measuring the date at which the art was covered. And in this case, there's sort of, you can kind of see there's just a little sort of smeary red mark under there, which is actually a red disc, and it was covered up around 41,000 years ago. So of course, this is from 2015. And so this, of course, is where people got really excited because they were like, well, were humans even there then? Is it Neanderthal? What's happening? And then, of course, just a couple of years ago, we've got the new study where they did uranium series in some other caves. Oh, here's from a hand where that handprint was covered up 37,000 years ago. So that gives you an idea. But yeah, so here's this is from La Pasiaga cave, which is actually next door to El Castillo. And in La Pasiaga was one of the 3 caves where they were able to get 65,000 plus year old dates. So at that point, even if you could kind of debate that we know humans were starting to hang around 40,000, at 65,000 there was no humans anywhere in the vicinity. And so if those dates are accurate, then like it has to be Neanderthal basically. And so that's where, you know, that's what makes those dates so interesting, and has also led to there being a lot of back and forth thing about, you know, the accuracy of the technique, and you know is it really 65,000, or is it, you know, some sort of contamination, how accurate can be in caves, etc. So the idea that I had, and I'm not the only one who's trying it, but I'm hopeful that we can set ourselves up for success. But you know, and in the future, I would love to see this actually become like a regular testing method that we use, kind of like carbon dating is now like normal and everybody does it. But what we're looking at hopefully doing next year is, and again, pandemic and everything, you know, has to get worked out. But National Geographic awarded me a grant to go see if we could try and extract any genetic material from some of the paintings over there. And I have the wonderful cooperation of the Cantabrian government to be able to go do this, because obviously that's a pretty big ask, to be able to go and take samples from their beautiful 40,000-year-old paintings. So, you know, so this is a big collaborative project that I'm really, really excited about. And that what we're going to be attempting to do is a lot of the really old stuff is spit painted. So of course that means they actually had it in their mouths and then spat the paint onto the wall, almost like basically a paleo spray can. And so what we're hoping is that some of the genetic material could have gotten locked in with the paint, and that, you know, with the incredible capacity of CRISPR nowadays, and the fact I have some very brilliant geneticists who are coming to do this project with me, who, yeah, I love listening to them, but I don't completely understand what they're always talking about, but it sounds really, really cool. So they're going to come, and we're going to hopefully be sampling several caves actually, where we've got art that has the right look to it. You know, there's sort of other criteria. So again, because I look at geometric signs, and to date, all of the art that has been proposed as being Neanderthal is all geometric, which is kind of interesting. There's nothing figurative that's been associated with Neanderthals. So of course I have all the geometric data. And so, yeah, there's certain caves that I think are sort of based on, you know, the data I've collected, working at the caves, that kind of thing, where I suspect they'd be a good bet for trying. How's that? So yeah, we're going to go give it a shot next year. And then also I'm hoping, I was talking to Dr. Enrico Capellini in Copenhagen, who he and I were having a great chat, and he's doing some fascinating stuff with like protein sequencing as well. And so that's another way, again, to try and get like sort of genetic material to try and identify. So what I figured was, let's see if we can access the identity of the artist directly. And then, so that's basically, so fingers and toes crossed, because it's a pretty high risk project with pretty low chance of success. But you know, the only way to do it is to start trying, right? And so even if we don't succeed, I'm sure we'll learn a lot from the attempt. But in the future, I suspect and I hope that genetic testing is actually something that becomes more standard at cave art sites, not only as a way to start figuring out the lineage of the artists, but also it could be used as an alternative dating method. Because with genetics, you can track as well, like, you know, what mutations have happened and what have not happened. And so it might actually act as another way to kind of bracket the art. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities. Basically, yay technology, using all these really cool high-tech methods to look at all the really old stuff, right? But yeah, I think there's a lot of good potential there. Oh yeah, and there's the whole Stellariform. So that's the one from La Pasiaga that they proposed to be 65,000 plus years old, and that may have been made by Neanderthal. Yeah, and with that, I will say thank you. Yeah, happy to answer some questions. So we covered a lot of ground. So thank you for sticking with me while I did my big monologue.
Thank you for taking us on this fantastic journey into the depths of like graphic communication and all these symbols. I'm going to start off because I take pride of place in asking the first question, and then, as you know, you may have seen from other previous SCRIBO seminars, the discussion is always very active, very lively, and full of excitement from the audience. So I will start and then leave the floor to whoever may want to ask interesting questions. I was astounded to see that your statistics on the penniform symbols really match up. And then I was trying to tie this with what you said at the beginning, given the possibility that these different geometric signs found on different caves in different areas of the world in different periods, because, you know, Upper Paleolithic is really a long time. The dating could range much farther than we think, so we can't really assume that they're synchronic, may have different meanings in different areas. So we have, in a way, we have a convergence in the geometric shapes, in the configurations. They all seem to end up into these like 32 geometric abstract signs. They may not be abstract at all, as you seem to have suggested, but then they may have different meanings. But then you have such a close match with your penniforms and your contextual possible meaning for what those penniforms mean, and the tie with the weaponry. And my question is, do you have a statistical database that can tell you whether all the other signs, the 32 signs, can have matches in terms of percentages in different contexts within different cave art and different sort of in different caves in different areas that may have such a great resounding match as you did with the penniforms? Is there a sort of a computational analysis that you've undertaken that can tie in with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've certainly started, I think, with that. I mean, yeah, again, you gotta, I would very much say that, yeah, I'm sure the meaning varies over time and space. That, you know, I think that I don't believe sort of that there's a universal meaning, and that's kind of what I was getting at, was that even with like the one particular sign, I think contextually it could have different meanings, just even within the same time period, but just in different locations. So again, if you see a dot and it's kind of at a split point in two passageways, it might very well be telling you take the right side, you know, right? So, or that if, again, you've got like a row, or you've got like a little group of 7, you know, maybe it is the Pleiades, like that research team had suggested. But in other contexts, if you've got red dots on the side of an animal, maybe in that particular context, it's a wound. And so I think that really, yeah, that it's all gonna, it's going to come down to context in that sense, I believe, a lot. And so, and I think that, again, that absolutely changes over time, especially what I would call with the most like the common signs. So those ones that tend to be simpler, you know, the angle signs we find all over the place too. You know, and again, I don't think there was vulvas everywhere, but which, you know, some people have said, but, you know, in certain contexts, sure, maybe some of them do represent like, but again, it's probably going to be this shape. I really don't think they're representing upside down vulvas, right? Like it's more likely, frankly, to be something different if it's contextually. So, and that's another thing that really hasn't been addressed is orientation. You know, because orientation is huge. We just, right now, we categorize them all based on whatever angle they're at.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I mean, I think the big thing is, you know, we're actually a really quite a small field. There's not that many of us. And, you know, there's just like endless projects to do. But yeah, orientation is something that's been on my mind as well.
And size as well, perhaps. Size
Yeah.
may be indicative.
Size, yeah. What about color? Yeah, color could also be, you know, right? So like there's all of these factors that have never been touched. I have this huge database. So, you know, in the future, like I'm really quite willing to share it with people. Because again, I will never get to all the things that I think are interesting and I'd like to know more about. When it comes to the penniforms or the idea of hunting, what I find so interesting about that is the question as well, though, that in Indonesia, the oldest figurative art which they have there, so they have these two different game animals. One's about 40,000 years old, and then one's now like 44,000 years old. In both cases, there's either something sticking out of the side of the animal or multiple things. And so it almost looks like they may be hunting scenes as well, and they've made that argument. And you know, it really got me thinking about the sort of the origin of, you know, how much does storytelling potentially play into it as well? Like, you know, sometimes are we seeing these important shots of stories on cave walls as well? And, you know, would that be something that if we're finding it at the earliest point in Indonesia, is it possible we're also finding it at the earliest point in Europe? And that's kind of one of the things that I've been looking at where, you know, there's no penniforms yet at the beginning, but there are examples of lines on animal sides and things like that. So were they representing them more using a line in that context? But yeah, and then absolutely over time there's going to be change, you know, and that, but each of the signs has a distinctive pattern. So in that sense, you know, that each one of them can actually be tracked over time and space. And that's kind of what I was trying to set up, was the idea that, you know, that penniforms might do this. And so, you know, again, they start in France during the Gravettian, and then we can kind of see them spreading out into Spain and into Portugal a bit, and then they sort of retract back into France. Like there's this really specific way they move over time. And so there's that one, and then again, but each of them has that kind of pattern. And so, you know, the level, like I think there'd be, again, there's a lot more we could probably do in the future with it. I would sort of say that this is very much kind of like a first pass in a way, just to see if there was something interesting. How's that? That I was like, oh, I wonder what I'll get. But yeah, no, when I got those statistical results back, yeah, I jumped up and down a couple of times. I was like, oh my God, like, you know, because I was like, it seemed plausible, but that's just so wonderfully, like, such strong statistical results that, yeah. So I was like, woohoo, people, you know, it's not just me sort of speculating. There's actually, like, you know, some good quality science there to back it up, right? And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that, you know, kind of moving forward, like, who knows what we could find if we tried it with other things, right? Like, I think part of it might even be just sort of running some stats in some different ways, maybe, you know, running it through like a GIS, like, and sort of seeing what's out there. But yeah, there's definitely, there's a ton still to be done, but each of the signs does have interesting things going on. But again, sometimes multi-layered, I think, with the fact that there's several things going on at the same time.
Yes, the combinations and the different configurations in the context, be it narrative or not, it doesn't matter, are worth expanding in terms of a database with computational aids and AI as well, as you mentioned. I think it's a very promising trajectory there. We have Judith Weingarten in the chat asking, do the geometric signs vary over time? You're dealing with such vast periods. I find it difficult to imagine that the signs used don't change.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, absolutely, they do change. And so in that sense, you know, you actually, for instance, with the handprints, the handprints are quite popular early on, and you find them at a broad range of sites, but sort of around the last glacial maximum, they basically disappear. And so, yeah, you've got some that kind of are like they're coming up, and then others are kind of dropping off. And then again, there's certain signs like a tectiform, which for instance, is very specific to kind of a smaller period, that, you know, in sort of this one region in France, almost all the tectiforms come from that one spot. And then there's one interesting outlier across the mountains in Spain, which looks very similar to the one one area, but again, they're from a very specific. And so I think in that sense that
oh, you're breaking up, Genevieve.
you know, we've got
you broke up a little bit for 2 seconds, Genevieve.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was gonna say yeah, with the tectiforms, you know, people have suggested maybe there's some sort of clan sign or some sort of and then again, but they only appear for this brief window of time, whereas other ones like lines and dots are found throughout, but may have different meanings in different times and places. How's that?
Okay, so they do change. There is another question in the chat, but I would love people to ask the question. Peter, Annick, could I ask?
Hi there. Okay, so
Thank you, because I'd like to see faces.
Okay, shall I ask my question then?
Yes, please.
All right. So
hi, Peter.
Hi, how are you? Great talk. So just following up on the questions about penniforms.
Yes.
So when you say that they're associated with animals, are you differentiating between like the inside and the outside, you know, like near an animal, as well as like the location within the animal for the penniform?
I didn't get as specific as the location within. At this point, like I said, I'd almost see it as more, it was almost more of a proof of concept. Do you know what I mean? Like I wanted to know if there was even something worth following up further, if that makes sense. But yes, I did differentiate between inside and outside. Almost all of them were inside. That's what's so fascinating. Yeah, I know I have like a master list, which has like all of the notes for like every single animal, but every single one. And there's very, very few that are nearby. There are a couple. And I think there's a handful. It's not a couple. There's a handful, but almost all of them are inside on the side. That's the most common. How's that?
Yeah, because I know
with the lines, for instance, the lines tend to radiate more. So, for instance, if you're looking at, because you know, there's a couple of humans, like for instance, at like Cunhac and places like that, where there's humans that have lines sort of radiating. So with the lines, they're more often on the outside, which is kind of interesting. But with the penniforms, they tend to be on the inside. So yeah, there's even slightly different patterns there. But yeah, no, there's so much that could still be sort of delved into. Like I felt like even with all of the data that I pulled and all the analysis, that yeah, there's still a lot more that could be done. How's that? Yeah. But I have to finish my PhD at some point here. It needs to be done.
I know with claviforms, I remember at Ciega Verde, there's a case of a horse with a claviform inside, and then there's another horse with a claviform outside.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. And so that's where
that might be another good one to look at.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And there's a couple. Yeah. There's one. You know, in Portugal too. So in one of the Coa sites. Yeah. There's one where there's like a penniform like on the neck of an auroch. And then there's other ones where again they're on the outside. And then even, you know, sort of differentiating between ones that have like sort of multiple shafts in a way, if you want to call it that, versus ones that only have like there's even within it. I mean, there's so many ways you can subdivide the categories in that sense. But what I thought was so fascinating with the penniforms was when you're talking about kind of the ones with say 2 to 3 lines down them, that exact sort of harpoon shape is found in the same region at the same time, like archaeologically. And so, you know, I think it makes more of an argument that, yeah, they may have actually been representing like a real world, you know, hunting implement that they were using, which makes sense. You know, they're representing a real animal. Why wouldn't they represent a real implement on its side, right? Sorry, I don't have more of an answer, but yes, there's more to be done.
There's a lot.
Delegating off more jobs.
I look forward to you sharing the database.
Me too. Genevieve, are you there? You seem to have frozen. We've been having so many technical glitches today. I was told that we also had a problem with the Facebook live streaming. But
okay.
Rest assured that we will post on the InScribe website the whole seminar so that everybody can listen to it even from tomorrow onwards. Richard Peter Wade wants to ask about the beads.
Beads, yeah. So, of course, what did you want? What were you asking? What did you want to know, Richard?
Richard.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
I'm from sort of darkest Africa. That's why it's so dark. And thank you for your amazing work. I worked with David Lewis Williams, and
right.
Thomas Huffman, and etc. And to see what you're doing is just wow.
Well, thank you. So, but we'll
I happen to notice your beads, and I fortunately, as an archaeologist, come everything. I can't see the size of the beads, but are they East African, Indo-Pacific beads, or?
That was the one from the slide that said like modern humans, modern behavior, and there was a flute and there was the beads, right?
No, your beads around your neck.
Oh, this. So, oh no,
yes.
This is. Oh. No, this was a present from my mother-in-law. So I'm not sure, but no, I think it's Canadian. I think it's just a Canadian one, which is where I'm from. But oh, that's too funny.
Cannot see them perfectly, but they look specifically like the Indo-Pacific beads that we excavate in Great Zimbabwe and Mapungubwe and certain portions. They look. I couldn't quite.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, so well, I was gonna say maybe I think it's got a Canadian influence to it. So I don't know what that means, but again, I'm a huge fan of the work of David Lewis Williams and all of your colleagues down there as well. I just feel like, and the big thing is too, is I feel like somewhere out there, like in Africa, like there is old cave art just waiting to be found, and I feel like we just need to figure out how to find it. Do you know what I mean? Like, because I feel like it is there somewhere.
That is particularly why when I studied under David Lewis Williams, I had to approach him on another aspect dealing with the fact that symbols are not always symbols. They are realistic representations of what was seen.
Yeah.
Specifically, Rappenglück's work in the Lascaux cave.
Yeah.
In 5. And then I have a thesis, Wade thesis, PhD, which you can online find, where I found the evidence of a supernova. And so, and well, there's a lot more, but there is cave art that dates to 1825 AD, representing Biela's comet, etc. So not everything is symbols, and I liked your presentation specifically where you mentioned there is and you pointed out the Lascaux cave as well. I appreciate that very much, because Rappenglück and myself never really were appreciated by symbolic, trance dance, Lewis Williams, etc.
Yeah.
But what you have found, that is where the answers lie. And what you are doing, that is what I really appreciate your talk for. And welcome, and I wish you the very finest.
Oh, thank you.
I'm sorry that your beads are not East African beads.
I know. So I'll just have to come work there in the future. How's that sound? Well, thank you for the kind words. Yeah, no, it's.
I agree with Richard on that one. In your book, you do talk about a mysterious necklace, actually.
I do. I know. That's why I thought maybe he was asking about that one. So, but I can't wear that one. That lives in the Lazy Z Museum.
Brilliant work, ladies. Absolute brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any more to be asked to Genevieve? Any interesting questions? I have so many, actually. We have Mattia Cartolano. Mattia, would you like to join us directly instead of asking or writing in the chat, please? Because I would like to see.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Thank you, Mattia.
All right. Great. Thank you for the talk, Jenny. It was wonderful. Because my research focused on human-animal forms of representation in prepottery Neolithic in Southwest Asia, I found that many of these forms of representation kind of relate to mortuary practices. So I'm just wondering if you've seen sort of these relations going on with the cave art, in the sense that proximity to these signs and images, you found also, remains, human remains, or other things that could be somehow related to mortuary practices. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So just to specify, my area is not. I'm not a specialist in sort of mortuary practices during the Paleolithic. Paul Pettit actually has an incredible book, which is literally called the Paleolithic Origins of Burial, and he literally covers all of the burials from the entire Paleolithic period. But from what I understand and from what I've seen, interestingly, people aren't buried in caves very often, for instance. And when they are, they're not necessarily associated with the art, which again, it actually seems strange to me as well, in the sense that, you would almost think that the two would go really well together. Now, again, in the grave goods, sometimes there are some interesting pieces. So for instance, the necklace, which was in one of them that did have markings on it, that necklace came out of a grave site in France. And it was actually, there's actually 70 some odd deer teeth that were part of that necklace, and over 40 of them have different configurations of geometric markings on them, basically. So in that sense, certainly they were getting buried with it. There's a cave in France I'm thinking of that has I think there's a hand near the burial. And then there was another one recently where they found some human remains near some of the art. But yeah, I can count them probably on like one and a half hands, basically, the amount of times that cave art is actually associated, and even sort of indirectly associated or partially associated with like some sort of burial. With that said, mortuary practices, we don't know, like, there's not that many burials that we found from the Paleolithic. And again, obviously probably I'm sure it changed over time, but if we're not dealing with necessarily everyone being buried under the ground, like interred. It's possible that there's sort of what do they call them, sky burials, things like that. I know in the part of Canada I live in, the First Nations often bury people in trees, like in boxes and trees. So again, it could be that the type of mortuary practice that they were practicing at various points just wasn't very conducive to things surviving in the archaeological record, which is sort of the curse of it all, right? Is that all we have to work with are like the stones and the bones, whatever survives. But with that said, I'm sure mortuary practices were really important. I don't see how they wouldn't have been. And so I'm sure that the art was associated in some way with it yet. But as with everything, I've always sort of spent my life trying to figure out how could we indirectly get at that, if that makes sense, since we don't have anybody to ask, and there's no written records for us to refer to. But again, looking at the work that you do in the Near East and what you've seen, the patterns that you've seen actually could be really insightful to then turn around and look back and say, okay, well, in the time period directly preceding that, are we seeing any sort of intermediate type behavior that might suggest that this is a continuation of something? So yeah, now I'm curious about what you're doing. And I want to see what you're finding. Because again, I think, that's the thing, that we create geological periods, we create eras, and we say, the Ice Age ended at 10,000 years ago, and we draw a line in the sand. But obviously for the people who lived back then, that's not how it worked, right? They're just a continuation that keeps going, and then change takes place over time, slowly, usually. So, I would suspect that some of it probably came forward with them. But yeah, if they're not burying their dead, then it's tough if we don't have a lot of examples to kind of work with.
Which reminds me that I have to reply to Mattia's email. He sent me an email yesterday and I didn't have any time to reply. I'm so sorry, Mattia.
No worries. Thank you very much for your talk, and thank you, Silvia, for organizing this amazing event. Thank you.
Any more questions, anyone? Because I have plenty. But I would like anybody to ask before me. Someone before me. Otherwise, I will ask you the other $1 million question, which is, the glimmers that underlie the invention of writing, and that is to me a tantalizing perspective, really, because I was very glad that you didn't mention the word pictogram in your talk, because I have so many pickles with that. I have so many sort of, you know, bones to pick on that one. And you do say very rightly that writing is a system when it is real writing, otherwise it's just what? Drawings. But, you know, playing devil's advocate here a little bit, if you have a symbol of something that you can utter the name of, then really you don't have a pictogram, because you tie it up with your own specific utterance, which may be language. And we know now that, for instance, even the Neanderthals were capable of uttering speech in a sort of an articulated way. So that is, in a way, a written notation that's very much tied to language, a linguistic articulation of sound that is tied to a specific linguistic whatever. Let's call it language for what it is, even if, you know, really, really, really ancient. So we don't have a pictogram, because what is a pictogram really? I mean, some people say what it is what you get. Yes, but if I call the drawing of a horse, I tie it up with the English language, and therefore what I have is truly a logogram, right? And a logogram is really well embedded within a system of linguistic notation.
Yeah.
So I don't want to sort of being sort of a nitpicker here. I don't want to be sort of too tedious on this one or too fastidious on this one. But really, it may not be a system, but it is written language. And if you have combinations of these pictorial symbols that are uttered, then you have a narrative iteration, repetition that makes sense to the people that are using it and transmitting it in what you very rightly define as graphic communication. So it may not be a system, and it may not be something that we can trace back to an original origin, as it were, pardon the pun, down to a continuous diachronic spectrum that ties us up with the first instances of writing as we know it, as a system. There is no continuity, there's no continuum, the spectrum is full of lacunae, whatever. But still, what it is, from a cognitive and linguistic perspective, is tantamount to what we have much later on, right?
Yeah. In principle, I think, yeah.
I don't like this straight jacketing of the earliest instances of written notation are Mesopotamia, are Egypt, are Mesoamerica. I don't like that. I find that sort of intellectually slightly...
It's sort of constricting in a way, right? I think again, so, you know, obviously linguistics is your area, not mine. So I'm always careful when I'm treading, because I recognize the nuances. It's so easy to miss the nuances when it's not your area of specialty. But I have thought it was really interesting that, you know, I think it comes down to a lot to how do we define writing. And from what I've been reading in linguistics lately, I think there's been some interesting debate going on about sort of narrow definitions of writing versus broader definitions of writing, and how that is into the fact that, you know, there are many cultures around the world who were considered to be illiterate, and yet had these perfectly functional systems of communication that worked very well for them. And where, as you were saying, like they are communicating with them. They are, in a way, but they're not systematic. They're not like, there's no grammar. There's not that kind of, that really controlled system. And so I think it comes down to, from what I've understood really, is to be sort of, how do you define writing? Is it narrow? Is it broad? But I think to me, really the really important underlying thing is when they first sort of like cognitively figured out that they could make marks that had meaning. And I think to me, that's what is really exciting, is that concept that underlies it. This, you know, that like, whoa, we can actually do this and somebody else can understand what I did. It seems so simple when we look back now, but I mean, man, that was a big leap. Like that was a really big jump that somebody made. And it's fascinating because, you know, there's so few things that have never been done before. And it's really one of those. Now, again, I think with Neanderthals potentially doing it as well, and Denisovans, you know, honestly, you know, I won't out a colleague that I've been talking to about it, but, you know, I think we really need to ask how far back do the origins of like graphic mark making go? Do they go back farther? And it's just that we haven't found it yet. Because I mean, half the battle when you're dealing with this kind of age depth is just that what we have is so small. Like, and how is it word? Like, we don't even know what we don't know, right? Like, I think, and then we find something and we're like, oh, who knew, right? So, you know, I think we're still really like kind of just sort of feeling around in there and trying to figure out like what is happening. But, you know, I think I agree with you that, you know, those utterances are in a way, yeah, like that they are a type of writing. I think it just depends on how you want to define writing. But in that sense, that's where I've tended to take the stance of being more academically cautious. So people don't stick me in the corner with the people who think aliens built the pyramids. How's that? I don't want to be in academic jail.
And also being recorded, you know.
But you know, so you know, I think in that sense, I really worked hard to figure out how to define what I was seeing and recognizing that, you know, it is different than like, you know, there's no dictionary, there's no, you know, you don't go to school to learn how to, you know, do this, and yet people have to teach you. It's just a lot more, you know, it's a lot less formal, and it's probably a lot more localized at that point. How's that? And I think maybe that's kind of the difference. It's the lack of formalization, the lack of like systematization on any like larger scale. But yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that, like I said, that they were making those marks on purpose, and they knew what they meant. And the people who were then able to come along and look at those marks and understand them knew what they meant. And so in that sense, I mean, it is reading and writing in a very basic sense. How's that?
I like that very much, actually, Genevieve. I like that very much. And I think this ties very nicely with your geometric shapes that are converging in different areas. It's that quantum cognitive leap that makes the possibility of recording things possible. And when we talk about recording, I would like to stress, because we have so many questions in the chat regarding the recording of this wonderful talk. You have so many congratulations in the chat coming your way as well. It is recorded. It will be posted on the Inscribe Invention of Scripts and Their Beginnings website tomorrow evening. So everybody can watch and rewatch this at their leisure whenever they want. We make sure that everybody has the fullest level of dissemination of what we do, and we strive for open access at all costs. So there it is. You can watch it and rewatch it again. I am told that there was a glitch with the Facebook streaming, but given the fact that this is recorded, everybody that couldn't make it on Facebook can watch it again on the Inscribe Invention of Scripts and Their Beginnings website. There are so many notes for you, Genevieve. I'm not going to read all of them in the chat, but there is a daughter who works at Creswell Crags and is very keen to watch a recording. And then there's somebody who has seen cave art from both Paleolithic and the Neolithic age, and the mystery of the meaning of the signs always fascinates me. The Diaz Cave here in Apulia, Italy, which makes me think of the Grotta Poesia in Apulia as well. I hope someday you will take those symbols into consideration too, although the Neolithic. So there you go, there's that continuity in the Neolithic.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the thing, is that, you know, I'm interested obviously in the very old end of it, but I'm also interested in the new end. Like, I think the beginning and the end are both very interesting in that sense. And like I said, I mean, it's sort of fluid. So, you know, trying to understand how far back in the archaeological record does this go, but also then understanding, like, how did we get from there to here is also very fascinating as well. And there's another big gap there. Like, it sort of feels like, again, there's sort of a big question mark of like, we've got the science during the Ice Age, we can sort of see what's going on with them a little bit, hopefully we're starting to understand. But then, yeah, how did we get from there forward? What's the relationship? Is there a direct relationship? Is it more just an overall theme of, hey, we can make marks that mean things, and then in different places people came up with different ways to do it? Like, yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot there. I think the Neolithic is very interesting to me as well. You know, I mean, in the long run, so not to be like ridiculously ambitious, but, you know, I would love to, you know, again, expand the database further. I'd love to find colleagues to work with in different parts of the world, and to make it like more of a global database, frankly. And then also I would love to bring in the portable pieces because like we're missing a huge part of the story by not having the portable pieces in with the art as well in that sense. So because you know they're part of the same system, they're part of the same graphic communication, and yet you know they're not there in the database of the cave art. You know, so I think that's another thing that really could be done. So yeah, when I you know, and again, what's the connection with the Neolithic and recognizing that you know that's what followed. And that again, times of change are often when things get really interesting. And so yeah, as the ice melted, as the world changed, it would have been, there's probably a lot of interesting push and pull factors there for where and how graphic communication developed further. So yeah, it'd be fascinating to look at that as well.
Can I join? Are there any more questions? Is there anybody that wants to ask a question?
Hi, Genevieve. Thank you for your talk. I would just like to ask a very quick question because this is not my field of research, so maybe I'm asking something that is well known to the others. But is the so-called inscription from La Pasiega the only example of a sequence of same-sized geometrical signs or marks?
Oh, B, you're breaking up.
That's what I was gonna say. I mean, I think I caught the gist of her question though. Yeah, so I just don't want her to not hear her answer. Hopefully she can hear me. But yeah, I mean, that's what's so interesting about the inscription.
Yes, of let's say geometric signs as a unique graphic.
Yeah, no, the inscription is very, very unusual. It's not common to have signs lined up that way, and especially not like sort of different signs like that. Like you see rows of lines more commonly or things like that. But what you do start to see is later on in the time period, there is more organization. How's that? You start to see things in lines more often, like in a row, but more commonly on portable objects. And this is again where I'm sort of muttering about the fact that, you know, we're sort of missing half the story by not having all of the portable pieces included in this database as well. Because again, there's such fascinating things, and they're in a way they serve a different function often as well, right? Like it's something that can be in your hand, you can take it with you, like so it's got a very different purpose to it potentially. But by the end of the Paleolithic, if you were to look up. There's a cave in France which has produced a really fascinating series of stone plaques that actually have different painted configurations on it. It's called Mas d'Azil. So M-A-S is the first word, and then the second word is d'Azil, so D'-A-Z-I-L. So Mas d'Azil. And if you Google it, you'll find like there's like, I think there's got to be over 100 for sure. But I think in that sense that if you're looking for greater organization, that tends to be where we start to see it. And then same with the necklace that I showed the photo of briefly. That's one of the ones where we start to find like mixed configurations, which feels different, doesn't it? Like it's sort of having a row of 4 lines is one thing, but suddenly when you start getting lines mixed with like, you know, crosses and then, you know, with like angles, it starts to feel like something different might be going on there. And I suspect that, again, I mean, over the course of this, you know, massive time period, I think they were starting, certainly in certain areas, they seem to have been focusing more on linear configurations, but it's later. And so some interesting factor must have like sort of popped up that made it useful for them. But yeah, the inscription is very unusual. It's very strange to find it. And I should point out, you can't really see in the picture, but it's probably about, if you can tell I'm North American here, it's probably about 20 feet up that wall. So what is that? Like 5 meters? Like it's way up a wall. Like it would have been hard to get to. It's not like down at ground level. Like you have to maybe 4 meters, but yeah. So you actually would have had to climb up this like really steep slope to leave it up there. And there's not really a lot. There's a few red blobs around it, but it's kind of by itself in that area as well. So it's an interesting spot for it to be. And then what's also interesting is that, for instance, that mark that almost looks like a backwards E, like a backwards capital E, it is found at a couple of other sites, including, again, that Mas d'Azil site with the portable pieces, you do find it on there, but that it's, again, it's a very unusual sign. So there's lots of interesting and intriguing, and so that's what I mean. That's like an entire project right there, just trying to track down those marks, right? So, yeah, there's so much to do, but yeah, it's a really good question, and it's very unusual. That's not the norm.
Very good question, actually. Barbara, you met Barbara yesterday, didn't you, Genevieve?
Yes, we met.
Yeah.
Very good question. We have Peter Anik. Do some signs occur more often in paints versus engraved, or vice versa?
Oh, Peter, it's another question that is burning to be answered, and I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. Within my database, though, everything is organized by whether it's engraved or painted. So the data is sitting there. It could be done. I haven't got around to it yet, but I've also wondered that same question. Or if certain things tend to appear in certain colors, which would be an interesting question as well, right? Do they tend to make circles in red, or, there's so much there's so much depth there, and I feel like I'm kind of constantly touching the surface just to be like, well, this is interesting. Let's see if anything cool comes to the surface if we look at this. But yeah, no, there's at this point, I don't have a sense. Claviforms tend to be painted. How's that? That's my sense with claviforms, is that overall they tend to be painted. There's one for you. But yeah, in general, I think it can be more just sort of based on where what materials they were using to do the art in that particular location. But yeah, when I look at claviforms, I feel like most of the ones I've seen. But you see, I'm using the word feel, right? So this is more just like a sense of it. It hasn't been studied, but yeah, that would be my sense with those ones. And then same with, I think a lot of the tectiforms are painted too.
But
you think with the dots, given that they're easy to create with a finger, those would be more likely to be painted. Whereas maybe lines, which are easy to engrave, or meanders might be something. So it could be a function of, what's easy to do as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, for sure. I think there could be that's what I mean. It's so rich. There's just so much to do, hey? But yeah, no, I think that as far as I know, nobody's looked at that either, about that question. But yeah, it's on my list along with things like orientation.
Clearly, the instrument creates, as Peter was suggesting, an affordance, and then the configuration of the shapes that comes out is clearly related to the way in which it is engraved or painted or whatnot. And that,
well, of course, yeah, because engraving, it's hard to make certain shapes when you're engraving, right? Or to do it smoothly, anyways. Without having to restart.
But despite that, you still find convergences in the configurations of the symbols that you find all over the world.
Yeah.
So clearly, cognitively, and that is another big question. Cognitively, what is it that makes a restraint or constraint or an affordance for the creation of a given shape versus another? That is like a sort of a dimension, a level that maybe needs to be analyzed as well.
Yeah.
To what extent can we explain why the shapes of these symbols look the way that they look, in other words?
Yeah.
From a
oh no, that's a really good point. Yeah, because again, there may be some very functional reasons as well why things are the way they are, or why they tended to be that way. But yeah, a lot of I'm thinking of the Spanish tectiforms too, which are quite complex shapes. Most of those are painted, which again would make sense in a way because there's a lot going on there. But I have seen one in Portugal, actually, in the Coa Valley. There's actually a very similar looking shape where it's sort of a subdivided kind of rectangle with different things going on, and that one's engraved. So here and there you do find them engraved, but yeah, overall those ones tend to be painted. But it could be that they're just easier if they're painted, right?
Yeah, well, Lake Combarel, right, which is very close to where you see other tectiforms. I wonder if there are any engraved tectiforms in Lake Combarel.
Let's see, because Lake Combarel, there's so much going on there. There has been some really detailed inventories done, but they haven't been published. I've managed to get bits and pieces of them, and I've been in the site a couple times myself as well. So here's a random fact for you. Did you know there's actually a human figure engraved in there with what looks to be one of those harpoon things in their hand? And I found it in this obscure old inventory, and I've been in the cave and I've never seen it. But now I'm like, well, now I have to go back to France and go see if I can locate it on the wall. So but yeah, and I think overall, with the tectiforms as well, they tend to be painted. Would be my feeling. But yeah, you do occasionally, you do see them. I'm thinking there's kind of I've seen some fairly complex, like in Las Chimeneas in Spain. I've seen some fairly complex finger fluting, but again, finger fluting is almost like painting, right? Like, because you're using a soft, squishy wall surface, and so again, you have a lot more latitude to how you move your fingers. There's a lot more rounded movements are possible, right?
Right.
So,
any more questions? It's been 2 hours nearly.
yeah.
Fantastic, they flew. Alpadilla, I'm not sure how I stumbled upon this superb talk. About halfway through, could you mention the, oh no, okay, this is a technical thing. Sorry, they keep on asking about the recording.
Oh, that's all good.
No, actually, you've had an insane amount of people checking in the Facebook website, despite the Facebook page, despite the technical glitches with the streaming. It's an insane number of people that checked in. So great success it's been. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know, it's only like my favorite topic, so you know, it's always a pleasure to come and chat about it.
It's becoming our favorite topic now. I really want to delve into the intricacies of this. Everybody's thanking you and congratulating you in the chat. Your book is amazing. A success.
I know, that's wonderful. We pulled it off, there we go. So,
it's been wonderful. I'm so sorry about the technical glitches. I'm so sorry about the screen sharing at the beginning.
Yeah.
The Facebook.
Welcome to our weird new world, right? We're all trying to figure it out.
Yes, but I think it affords so many possibilities. You wouldn't have been able to come to Bologna had, you know, had the pandemic not hit us, and this was we turned it into an opportunity to meet and to hear your wonderful ideas. And I relish your book. It's, you know, it's on my bedside table. It gives me a lot of food for thought. So it's been wonderful. Thank you so much. If there's one more question from anyone that wants to ask it, we have 1 minute. Why not? When is your next book gonna come out?
Oh
that
my
is
God.
the question.
Well, because first of all, we got to go do some more research, right? So because of course we were going to go do that project this summer, but now we're going to do next summer. So one other project I'll tell you about really quickly, which we're hoping to slip in while we're over there, is I've actually got access to an underwater ROV, like to an underwater robot. Wow. And we're going to go see, so with some colleagues of mine from Basque Country, actually, there's some semi-submerged caves that we're going to go see if we can use the ROV to like explore remotely. Because again, speaking of all the caves that we've lost, you know, during the Ice Age, the water levels were much lower than they are today. And there was these big coastal plains. And so we've probably lost a lot of caves that way. And so we're curious to see if there might be any art left, you know, intact in some of these caves in the right conditions. So kind of like Cosquet in France. So yes, so stay tuned.
Oh, wonderful. Is this another sneak preview that you haven't?
I know. So that's what I mean, is that, yeah, I'm always kind of coming up with all these ideas of, yeah, I'm really interested in like all the different ways we can kind of use technology, you know, and computers to sort of like approach, funnily enough, like sort of this ancient chapter in our history. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential to just do so many things. So yeah, no, I think my big thing now will be trying to find fun people to work with so that we can start expanding, because there's way too much for me to do.
Fantastic. I can't wait to hear more. We will invite you again for sure.
Please, yes.
Live in Bologna with some tortellini and lasagna and the like.
I know. I was going to say, next time in person, maybe.
Yes, it's been wonderful, and it's been such an eye-opener for me. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It was a great beginning of a new season of the SCRIBO seminars. We will have our next one on the 30th of September, in 2 weeks' time, with Alex Devot from Drew University, who's going to be talking about this weird script from the Caroline Islands. So please join us then. It's been wonderful. See you again. Thank you so much, Genevieve. Say hi to
Thanks for being such a great audience.
To your kids. Everybody loves the talk, I'm sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It was very fun.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Goodbye.